If you told me a year ago that I'd end up in an all-out war over a mailbox, I would have laughed and called you crazy. But now, I can only smirk and say, I wish it had just been about a mailbox. It all began on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The sky was gray, my coffee was too bitter, and I had a deadline looming. The last thing I needed was to find my mailbox lying face down in the grass like a fallen soldier, bent, scratched, and cracked at the hinge. Letters fluttered around it like defeated white flags. I stood there, confused. Maybe it was an accident, I told myself. Could have been a reckless delivery driver, or maybe a bored teenager with a baseball bat. I shrugged it off, straightened it as best I could, and went on with my day. But 2 days later, it happened again. Same damage. Same mess of mail scattered like confetti after a bad parade. By the third time, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I live in a peaceful, well-manicured suburban community. Too well-manicured, if you ask me. There are rules for everything. How tall your grass can be, what colors your shutters can be painted, even how many garden gnomes are considered acceptable. And overseeing it all with the icy precision of a hawk in heels is Margaret Whitmore, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. Margaret doesn't just enforce the rules, she becomes them. She's the kind of woman who measures sidewalk cracks with a ruler and files formal complaints about wind chimes. Her house is pristine, her rose bushes trimmed like a military haircut, and her stare could freeze boiling water. And now, apparently, she had a problem with my mailbox. At first, she didn't say it outright. She just made offhand comments when we passed each other on the street. Still haven't replaced that old thing, Henry? You know, a mailbox is like a handshake. Yours is limp. I wanted to believe it was just snobbery. But things escalated. One night, I heard a faint thud around 2 a.m. When I looked outside, I saw nothing but darkness. The next morning, the mailbox was dented again. Enough was enough. I needed answers. Not just for my sanity, but because I refused to be intimidated in my own home. So, I installed a motion-activated security camera above my porch. Not just to catch the mailbox vandal. I told myself it was for general security. But deep down, I knew who I was watching for. On the first night, I stayed up, watching the live feed with the same anticipation people reserve for thriller movies. And sure enough, right around 2:15 a.m., the screen lit up. There she was, Margaret, in a long floral robe, hair pinned up like she'd stepped out of a 1950s soap opera, holding a flashlight and staring at my mailbox like it owed her money. She didn't hesitate. She walked up briskly, glanced over her shoulder, and, bam, kicked it. Not once, but twice. The second kick had technique, like she'd practiced. I froze, half in shock, half in awe. Who does that? What kind of person puts on slippers, grabs a flashlight, and commits a federal offense in their bathrobe? I replayed the footage 3 times, partly to make sure it was real, partly because it was surreal entertainment, and then I laughed, hard. But here's the thing. I didn't confront her. I didn't call the police. I didn't even tell the HOA. Why? Because I wanted to see how far she would go. And, I admit, a part of me wanted to have fun. The next morning, I installed a brand new mailbox. Nothing flashy. Just plain and polite. As if to say, hey, I'm still here. Try again. And she did. The following night, she returned. This time more subtle. She didn't kick. She used both hands to push the mailbox sideways, then strutted away like she'd just cleaned up litter from the street. I watched the footage with my morning coffee, smiling like a man who discovered a wild animal on his property. Margaret was clearly obsessed, but she underestimated me. If she wanted to turn this into a battle, I'd give her a war she'd never forget. Certainly. Below is part 2, titled The Titanium Trap and the Foot That Met Its Match, written in smooth, engaging English with creative tension, natural build-up, and vivid imagery. By now, it wasn't just a broken mailbox. It was a message. Every time Margaret came in the night, flashlight in hand, and floral robe fluttering in the breeze like the cape of a villain, she wasn't just committing petty vandalism. She was declaring dominance. To her, my property was an eyesore, and my silence was permission. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't staying quiet because I was scared. I was preparing, I spent the next few days researching materials like I was gearing up to build a fortress instead of a mailbox. Concrete? Too basic. Reinforced steel? Not satisfying enough. I even flirted with the idea of an electrified booby trap, but I figured jail wasn't worth the punchline. Then I found it. Titanium. Lightweight, virtually indestructible, corrosion-resistant, and best of all, impressively overkill. It was perfect. I made a few calls. Found a specialty locksmith who thought I was joking at first. When he realized I wasn't, he got excited. Apparently, building a mailbox that could survive a nuclear winter was a dream job for some people. We scheduled the install for Saturday morning. The sun was just peeking over the rooftops when the work began. I stood proudly with my arms crossed as the locksmith poured reinforced concrete into a custom base, anchoring a solid titanium pole 6 feet into the earth like it was a flagpole for freedom. At the top, the mailbox itself gleamed in the light, sleek, minimalist, and utterly indestructible. That's when I saw her. Margaret's car slowed as it passed. She stopped, dead in the middle of the sidewalk, her eyes locked on the construction site like she'd just witnessed a crime. I waved cheerfully. "Good morning, Margaret. Lovely day for home improvements, don't you think?" She didn't say a word, just clenched her jaw and drove off, tires crunching gravel like thunder. That night, I didn't just watch the camera feed, I set the stage. I brewed a fresh pot of dark roast, turned down the lights, and reclined in my chair with the screen glowing in front of me like a stage curtain about to rise. At 2:08 a.m. she returned. Margaret moved with the same routine precision as always. Robe, flashlight, fury. But this time she looked different. Tense, almost nervous. She hovered near the edge of the lawn like she was considering backing out. But pride is a dangerous thing. She stepped forward. Her flashlight beam traced the surface of the titanium mailbox like a sword drawn before battle. She reached out, touched the smooth metal, then backed up. Just a step. Then, 2. She squared her shoulders, took a breath, and kicked. Now, I've seen a lot of things in my life, but nothing was quite as beautiful as what happened next. The sound echoed like a bell in a cathedral. Clang. Her foot hit the titanium like it had struck a wall of fate itself. The impact was so violent that she was lifted backward, arms flailing, and crashed onto the sidewalk in a tangled mess of fury, pain, and polyester. The flashlight rolled away, casting spinning shadows. Margaret writhed, clutching her foot, unleashing a string of profanities that would have made a pirate blush. I sipped my coffee and whispered, "And the Oscar goes to..." After a minute or two of dramatic moaning and awkward attempts to stand, she limped away, dragging her dignity behind her like a dead limb. But before she left, she turned around and glared at the mailbox. Not with victory, not with defiance, but with shock. As if she finally understood that she had lost. And I knew in that moment, this war had changed. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was humiliated. The next morning, as I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, the universe rewarded me. There she was, Margaret Whitmore, tyrant of the HOA, sitting stiffly on her porch bench, one foot propped on a cushion, wrapped in ice. Her face was pinched, pale, and furious. She wore oversized sunglasses even though it was still cloudy, and she pretended not to see me. I gave her a friendly wave. "Hope you're feeling better. Heard there's a rogue mailbox in the neighborhood. Dangerous stuff." She said nothing, but her jaw clenched so hard I could almost hear her molars crack. But the best part? Everyone saw it. Word travels fast in a community like ours. By noon, neighbors were already murmuring. By evening, it was legend. Margaret, the iron-fisted enforcer of neighborhood aesthetics, had injured herself in a bizarre midnight encounter with a mailbox. The story changed slightly each time it was retold. Some said she tried to rip it out with her bare hands. Others claimed she used a sledgehammer and lost. I didn't correct them. Let the myth grow. But while most would have learned their lesson and moved on, I knew Margaret wouldn't. Not her. Not the woman who once fined a neighbor for having overly reflective wind chimes. No, she wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. And I, my friend, was just getting started. Absolutely. Here's part 3, titled The Courtroom Gambit and the Letter of the Law. Written in smooth, dramatic English with vivid imagery, emotional tension, and a naturally unfolding legal showdown. You'd think after kicking a titanium mailbox so hard she nearly broke her foot, Margaret Whitmore would finally admit defeat. But Margaret didn't know how to lose. She didn't retreat. She escalated. 3 days after her midnight misadventure, a black luxury sedan with tinted windows pulled up outside her house. I was watering my lawn when it happened. The moment I saw the personalized license plate, ESQ LLC, I knew exactly what was coming. Margaret had hired a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. This man looked like he'd been airlifted from a courtroom drama on primetime TV. Expensive suit, silver tie pin, the kind of voice that probably charged by the syllable. She was serious. I didn't hear from them directly, not at first. The ambush came by mail, fittingly enough. A thick, cream-colored envelope stamped with gold lettering and pretension. Inside was an official notice. Margaret was suing me. Intentional installation of a hazardous structure with the intent to harm others, the claim read. Negligence, malice, public endangerment. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my cereal. The woman who had spent months trespassing and destroying my property had now filed a lawsuit. Because she hurt herself trying to do it again. You couldn't make this up. But I knew better than to brush it off. Margaret was ruthless, and people like her didn't need to be right. They just needed to be loud, well-dressed, and litigious. So I prepared. I didn't hire a lawyer. I didn't need one. I had the truth. And more importantly, I had footage. The day of the hearing was gray and muggy, like the sky itself was reluctant to get involved. The local courthouse was small, with wood-paneled walls and flickering fluorescent lights. Margaret arrived 20 minutes early, dramatically limping on her bandaged foot like a soap opera victim. Her lawyer trailed behind her, briefcase in one hand, arrogance in the other. I walked in with nothing but a flash drive in my pocket and a quiet smile. No suit, no entourage, just me, my truth, and the knowledge that this entire performance was about to collapse like a badly built stage. The courtroom was nearly empty, just a bored clerk, a sleepy security guard, and a judge who looked like she'd rather be golfing. When the session began, the judge glanced at the paperwork, sighed, and said, "Counselor, you may present your case." Margaret's lawyer stood and launched into a monologue worthy of Broadway. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, a respected member of the community, suffered a severe injury due to the defendant's reckless and deliberate installation of a structure known to be excessively durable and lacking any form of warning signage." He paused for dramatic effect, placing a hand gently on Margaret's shoulder. She was unaware of the danger posed by the defendant's metal monstrosity. I stifled a laugh. Metal monstrosity? The judge turned to me. "Mr. Collins, how do you respond to these allegations?" I stood slowly, cleared my throat, and said, "Your Honor, this is the 4th mailbox I've had to replace in 6 months. I installed a durable one because I was tired of vandalism." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you have any evidence?" That's when I pulled out the flash drive. "Yes, ma'am. May I submit this security footage?" She nodded. A court officer took it, plugged it into a laptop, and projected it onto the small screen at the front of the room. What followed was cinematic gold. Margaret. 2:08 a.m. Robe. Flashlight. Determination. She approached the titanium mailbox like it had insulted her ancestors. She hesitated, backed up, and then, kick. The sound echoed through the courtroom, a sharp metallic clang, followed by her entire body flying backwards and crumpling onto the sidewalk. She writhed, cursed, grabbed her foot. Pure slapstick tragedy. The video paused on a perfect freeze frame. Margaret mid-fall, face twisted in pain, flashlight mid-air. No one spoke, not even her lawyer. Finally, the judge leaned back, took off her glasses, and exhaled through her nose. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you kick this mailbox of your own free will?" Margaret stammered, eyes darting. I didn't know it was that strong." The judge cut her off with a tired wave of the hand. "Case dismissed. Next." Boom. Just like that. Her lawyer looked like he'd swallowed a stapler. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish trying to remember how air worked. I thanked the judge, nodded politely, and walked out without another word. But the best part? It wasn't the win. It was watching Margaret limp out of that courtroom, flushed, furious, and powerless. You'd think she'd stop there. But Margaret didn't lose. She plotted. And I knew. She was just getting started. Absolutely. Here is part 4, titled The Reversed Petition and the Neighborhood Uprising, written in smooth, natural English with creative storytelling, dramatic turns, and escalating tension, just as you requested. You'd think getting humiliated in court, on video, would finally convince Margaret Whitmore to step down from her self-appointed throne. But no. She didn't see the loss as a lesson. She saw it as an injustice. And when people like Margaret feel wronged, they don't reflect or retreat. They retaliate. 3 days after the courtroom debacle, something curious happened. Flyers appeared on neighborhood doors, folded neatly and printed with the HOA logo, though I strongly suspected Margaret had just stolen a template from an old newsletter. Urgent community safety matter, it blared in bold letters. Sign the petition to have a dangerous mailbox removed. I nearly choked on my morning coffee. She was now claiming that my titanium mailbox posed a threat to the safety of the community, specifically to children at play. The only problem? There were no children in our neighborhood. Sunset Glen was mostly made up of retirees, quiet couples, and the occasional cat. The closest thing we had to a child was Max, a 14-year-old golden retriever who spent most of his days snoring in his owner's garden. But logic had never been Margaret's strength. Still, she went door to door, hobbling on her still-bandaged foot, clutching her clipboard like it was the Constitution. She rang every bell. She repeated her lines like a bad actress in community theater. This mailbox is a lawsuit waiting to happen. What if a child ran into it at full speed? It's practically a weapon bolted to the sidewalk. The reactions were less than supportive. Mrs. Green, who lived 3 houses down and had once been fined by Margaret for painting her shutters a slightly non-regulation shade of blue, simply closed the door in her face. Mr. Ramirez, the grumpy ex-Marine who watered his lawn in socks and didn't talk to anyone, looked her dead in the eye and said, "Margaret, for the love of God, shut up." But the crown jewel of neighborhood rebellion came from someone unexpected. Diane Marks, a retired school principal with a polite smile and a spine of titanium stronger than my mailbox. When Margaret handed her the petition, Diane read it slowly. Then, in front of her, took out a pen and flipped the page over. She started a new petition. A formal request for the removal of Margaret Whitmore from the HOA and the community of Sunset Glen. She signed it, in bold letters, then walked door to door, just like Margaret had done. Only this time, people opened their doors eagerly. You could feel it, something shifting. Years of resentment were boiling to the surface. The fines, the warnings, the passive-aggressive notes about lawn length, wind chimes, driveway cracks. It had all added up. People were ready. By the end of the second day, Diane had over 30 signatures. By the third, she had half the neighborhood. And the petition wasn't just a statement, it had legal teeth. According to the community bylaws, ironically written by Margaret herself, if a resident was deemed a recurring disturbance and lost the support of the majority, the HOA board had grounds to call for removal proceedings. And that's exactly what happened. An emergency email went out from the HOA board, this time not written by Margaret. Subject: Special Community Meeting, Discussion Regarding Resident Conduct. The subject line didn't name her, but everyone knew. The night of the meeting, the community hall was packed tighter than a garage sale on discount day. I arrived early, took a seat near the back, and watched as people filed in, some smiling, some whispering, many holding printouts of Diane's petition. Then, right on cue, Margaret walked in. She wore a beige pantsuit, and a smile stretched so tightly it looked like it might crack. But her eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, betrayed her. She knew. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to survive. The board chair, an elderly man named Carl, who normally only spoke in HOA jargon, stood up, cleared his throat, and addressed the crowd. We've received multiple formal complaints regarding Mrs. Whitmore's conduct over the past several months. As per HOA charter guidelines, we are initiating a vote for her removal." Margaret stood up so fast she nearly knocked over her chair. "This is absurd. You're all being manipulated. This is a witch hunt led by him," she said, pointing directly at me. Everyone turned to look. I just raised an eyebrow and sipped my water. "I have served this community for 12 years, she hissed. "Without me, this place would fall into chaos." From the back of the room, someone muttered, "Sounds good." The vote commenced. One by one, neighbors raised their hands. Carl called the names aloud, and with each hand lifted, Margaret's face sank a little further. Unanimous, every single person. The final verdict. Margaret Whitmore had 30 days to vacate the community, and when Carl announced it, something magical happened. The entire room erupted, in applause. Real, honest, unfiltered joy. The reign of Margaret was over. Sunset Glen had taken its neighborhood back, and I, my friend, watched it all unfold with the kind of satisfaction you can't buy. The kind that only comes after months of silent patience, creative resistance, and one titanium mailbox that refused to be bullied. For 30 days, Margaret Whitmore's kingdom crumbled, one cardboard box at a time. It was almost poetic, watching the for sale sign appear in front of her pristine beige house, its bold red letters clashing with the obsessive symmetry of her lawn. Every morning, I passed by on my walk, coffee in hand, and gave her a cheerful wave. She never waved back. Instead, she sat on her porch like a dethroned monarch, glaring at the world through oversized sunglasses, a permanent scowl etched into her face. It wasn't just her foot that was bruised anymore. It was her pride, her reputation, her illusion of power. And the neighborhood? Oh, the neighborhood thrived. In the weeks following the vote, it was like the fog lifted. People who used to avoid each other were suddenly chatting in driveways. Lawn chairs appeared on porches. Someone even organized a weekend potluck. Something unthinkable under Margaret's rule. Turns out, when you remove fear, community fills the gap. But the real finale, the one that stays with me even now, came on her final day. It was a Sunday morning. The air was crisp. Sunlight filtered through the maple trees like gold dust. I stood at the end of my driveway pretending to check my mailbox, which, by the way, still stood tall and flawless. That's when the moving truck arrived. It was a loud, dented old thing, comically out of place in her pristine driveway. The movers, all in matching shirts that read "Rough and Ready Hauling," looked confused when they saw her pacing like a general about to lose a battle she didn't understand. She barked orders, micromanaged box placement, tried to make them avoid stepping on her grass. But there was no more control, no more HOA badge, no more clipboard, just a woman watching her world slip away, one packing tape screech at a time. Neighbors gathered, not out of cruelty, but curiosity. Some stood on porches, arms crossed. Others peeked from windows. And slowly, like a spontaneous ceremony, a crowd formed across the street. Not a word was said. Until Diane Marks, the retired principal turned neighborhood hero, stepped forward. "Good luck, Margaret," she said, voice polite but firm. "Hope your next neighborhood is as detail-oriented as you are." Margaret didn't reply. She simply turned, climbed into the passenger seat of her sleek black SUV, and slammed the door with a finality that echoed down the street. The truck pulled away. The SUV followed. And just like that, she was gone. A wave of silence passed over the crowd. Then someone clapped, just once, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire block erupted into applause. It wasn't celebration for her leaving. It was a release, a reclaiming, a joyful, cathartic ending to years of being ruled by fear, disguised as order. As the clapping died down, I found myself smiling. Not because she had lost, but because the neighborhood had won. Not just against a petty tyrant, but against the idea that silence and control should ever be mistaken for peace. That night, I sat on my porch and stared at the titanium mailbox gleaming in the moonlight. It had started as a simple act of defiance. A joke, really. But it became a symbol, a reminder that dignity is worth defending. That standing your ground doesn't always mean shouting. It can mean waiting, watching, and acting when the moment is right. Epilogue. 1 month later. The house sold quickly, but the new owners were the real surprise. A young couple in their 30s, easygoing, friendly, creative. On move-in day, I brought over a welcome basket. Baked cookies, some tea, and a note with emergency contacts. They smiled wide, grateful and warm. "We heard there used to be tension around here?" the woman asked gently, glancing around. "Oh," I said, grinning. "Just a little neighborhood drama, ancient history." As I walked home, I passed by my mailbox again. Still perfect, still standing. I tapped it twice like a good luck charm. And maybe, just maybe, it really was. Final message. Sometimes battles choose us. Not the grand ones with banners and horns, but the small ones, quiet, ridiculous, personal. The kind fought not with fists, but with patience, proof, and principle. It doesn't take much to stand your ground. Sometimes all it takes is a mailbox that refuses to fall. Absolutely. Here's a 1,000-word conclusion written in smooth, creative, and emotionally compelling English. It wraps up the story powerfully, delivers life lessons, and ends with an inspirational call to action and engagement prompt for the StoryForge channel. Looking back now, it's easy to laugh. A titanium mailbox. A woman in a bathrobe kicking it like it owed her rent. A lawsuit that collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. A petition that flipped so hard, it boomeranged right back at the one who started it. And finally, an entire neighborhood erupting in applause as the self-appointed queen of suburban control packed her last box and drove away. Yes, it's funny. It's absurd. It's the kind of story you tell at dinner parties and watch your friends shake their heads saying, "No way that really happened." But beneath the laughs, beneath the slapstick chaos and courtroom drama, there's something deeper. A truth. A lesson. A quiet, powerful reminder of what matters and what doesn't when we talk about power, pride, and people. Because this story was never really about a mailbox. It was about boundaries, literal and emotional. It was about how we react when those boundaries are challenged. Do we explode in anger? Do we back down and let it happen? Or do we hold our ground with dignity and cleverness? For months, I watched as one woman tried to enforce her version of order by controlling everything around her. She cloaked it in rules, wrapped it in concern, and called it community preservation. But in the end, it wasn't about the neighborhood. It was about control, hers over everyone else. And that's where the lesson lives. Because in real life, we all face our own Margarets. Maybe it's a boss who takes credit for your work. Maybe it's a friend who constantly crosses lines. Maybe it's a neighbor who turns petty complaints into power plays. Or maybe it's that little voice in your head that tells you to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to just let it go. But here's what this story taught me, and what I hope it teaches you too. You don't have to shout to stand strong. You don't need revenge to earn justice. You don't need to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you fight it with a titanium mailbox, and a whole lot of patience. Because sometimes the best revenge is outlasting the storm, and watching the sun come back out, with your mailbox still standing tall. What I didn't expect was how this ridiculous little battle brought our neighborhood together. People who hadn't spoken in years started bonding over shared frustrations. Walls came down, stories came out. We laughed, we vented, we united. That's the power of a common cause, even one wrapped in titanium. And maybe that's the real magic here. It wasn't about winning against Margaret. It was about reclaiming a sense of community, one where decency matters more than dominance, where kindness outweighs control, where people listen not because they're afraid, but because they care. In a world that feels increasingly loud, divided, and chaotic, maybe this tiny suburban rebellion can remind us of a powerful truth. The quiet battles we fight, for respect, for space, for our voice, are never meaningless. They shape the neighborhoods we live in, the workplaces we show up to, the relationships we nurture. And when we choose to stand up, not with fists, but with grace, strategy, and truth, we show others it's possible too. So if you're watching this and thinking about your version of the mailbox, that one thing you've been tolerating too long, that person who's pushed your limits one too many times, that line you've been afraid to draw, let this be your sign. You're allowed to stand your ground. You're allowed to protect your peace. And yes, you're even allowed to upgrade to titanium if that's what it takes. Because in the end, life isn't just about the big victories. It's about the little ones too. The quiet moments where you choose dignity over drama, where you outsmart instead of outshout, where you build something solid and let it speak for you. So, what about you? What mailbox are you dealing with in your life right now? Who's your Margaret? What battle have you been avoiding because you thought it was too small to matter? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And who knows? Your story might just inspire the next tale here on the Story Forge. If you enjoyed this journey, if you laughed, felt empowered, or just love a good underdog win, like, share, and hit that subscribe button. Because here at the Story Forge, we don't just tell stories. We forge them out of fire, grit, and a little bit of poetic justice. Until next time, stand tall, stay grounded, and don't let anyone kick your mailbox. Subscribe now and follow us for more stories that matter. This is the Story Forge, where every story has a spark, and sometimes even a mailbox can start a revolution.